You could smell it from the end of the street. And it meant one thing. Someone at home loved you. Not loved you the way people say they love you now. Quickly, lightly, in passing, across a phone screen. Loved you in the old way. The way that took all morning. The way that left flour on the counter and a warm, yeasty sweetness drifting through every room of the house, out through the kitchen window, across the backyard, down the front path, and all the way to the corner of your street, where you, something that had been slightly tensed, slightly uncertain, the way children always are in the hour before they reach home, felt it let go, because home was there. You could smell it. It didn't come from a candle. No candle has ever managed it, and the manufacturers have spent decades trying. It didn't come from a spray bottle, a sachet, a wax melt, or anything with a label that said fresh baked bread in cheerful lettering. It came from a bowl, from flour and water, and a little packet of yeast, in the hands of a woman who had learned this from her own mother, who had learned it from hers, in kitchens long gone, in houses that some of us can still picture, and some of us can only gauge. It came from 2 hours, sometimes 3, of quiet, unhurried, deeply patient work, the kind of work that filled the house with warmth, the kind that made everyone in it feel, without quite being able to say why, that everything was going to be all right. Do you remember the day of the week she baked? Was it always the same? For many families it was. There was a day for bread. Some mothers baked on Monday, the week stretching out ahead of them, the weekend's heavier meals behind, the need for sandwich bread pressing quietly at the back of the week's plans. Others baked on Saturday morning so the family could begin Sunday with something fresh and golden on the table. A few baked on Wednesday, splitting the week in two with the smell of baking, breaking whatever ordinariness had accumulated by midweek with something extraordinary that required no occasion to justify it. Whatever the day, there was a ritual to it, a preparation, a gathering of things that was itself a form of ceremony. And it began, always, the same way. The yeast came first. That small envelope, or the little glass jar with the red and yellow label, Fleischmann's perhaps, or a Red Star, the jar that sat in the cupboard alongside the spices and the vanilla extract and the small things that were used regularly but it was alive, in a way that was not always easy to explain to someone young enough to find that surprising. It needed warmth. It needed a little sugar to wake on. It needed, in some sense, that no recipe ever quite put into words, coaxing. The way you coax a reluctant fire. The way you coax a sleeping person into wakefulness on a morning when sleep wants to hold them. Gently, warmly, with patience and the right conditions. And so the warm water was measured into a small bowl, or a glass measuring cup, with its painted-on numbers worn faint from years of use. And the yeast was sprinkled over it, and a pinch of sugar stirred in, and then the waiting. Not long, a few minutes, perhaps 5, but in a kitchen that was quiet and warm and smelled already of the morning, of coffee and toast, and the faint comforting presence of a house settling into its day. Those few minutes had a quality all their own. And then it happened. The bloom. The yeast began to swell, to soften, to foam across the surface of the warm water. In a way it was quiet but emphatic, as though the life in those tiny organisms was pleased to be woken and glad to get to work. The smell that rose from it was earthy and slightly sweet, and faintly of something ancient, something that had been blooming in human kitchens for thousands of years before anyone knew what yeast even was. That first smell, the yeast just waking, just releasing its small living breath into the warm air of the kitchen, was the first note of a fragrance that would build for the next several hours into something that could travel down a residue. Who baked the bread in your house? And did you ever learn to make it yourself? The flour came next, measured and sifted. Perhaps she used gold metal, in the familiar red and gold bag worn soft at the corners from handling. Perhaps Pillsbury, or for those families in Canada, Robin Hood. The name itself somehow suited to a flour that would help feed the people who needed feeding. She measured it with the quick, assured movements of someone who had done this enough times, that the hands knew what the right amount looked and felt like without much need for deliberation. A cup scooped, the excess brushed off perhaps, or perhaps not, because the hands knew. They always knew. The large bowl was already set out on the counter. Earthenware, perhaps, with a rim thick enough to grip comfortably. The kind of bowl that had its own weight and its own warmth, and had darkened at the rim over years of steady use, the glaze wearing away at the places where the spoon most owes. Or perhaps it was enamelware, white with a thin border of blue or red around the lip, the kind that chipped at the edges, but was never discarded because it was too correct for the job, too right in the hand, too much a part of the way this into that bowl. The flour, then the salt. Not measured with fanfare, but estimated with a teaspoon, or simply pinched between the fingers. The right amount added the way any practiced cook adds seasoning, not by rule, but by accumulated knowledge. Then a little sugar, or sometimes a slow amber drizzle of honey from the jar, falling from the spoon in a thread that caught the light for a moment before disappearing into the flour. And the fat, a generous spoonful of lard, white and dense, or a pat of soft butter, or a spoonful of Crisco from its blue and white tin, solid and neutral smelling and reliable, in the way that was, in those years, considered a virtue and then the yeast water, foamy and alive, poured in with care. There was one thing every bread baker did before putting the loaf in the oven. A small, almost superstitious gesture that no recipe ever mentioned. We will come to it. But first, the mixing. The wooden spoon came in. The old one, worn smooth at the handle from years of steady grip, slightly darker at the bowl from heat and absorption and time. It moved through the ingredients in large, slow circles, pulling the dry into the wet, coaxing the shaggy, reluctant mass into something that began, slowly, unevenly, to hold together. It was not yet dough. Not really. Not yet. It was a rough, sticky, slightly unpredictable beginning. The kind of beginning that looks unpromising and smells of raw flour and requires someone who has been here before to look at it without alarm. And it was not until the hands came in that it became something real. Can you still see the flour on her hands? The way it dusted up past her wrists, the way she pressed her palms into the dough with that quiet, certain authority, the way the heel of her hand pushed forward and the fingers folded the mass back toward her in one long, unhurried motion. Kneading. The word sounds like what it is: insistent, physical, rhythmic. This was not a delicate task. It required the whole upper body, the arms pressing forward, the shoulders leaning in, the weight of the torso behind each push, the heels of both hands working the dough against the floured counter or the wooden board with a steady commit. It was the force of someone doing work that needed to be done and knowing how to do it. 10 minutes at least, often 12 or 15. The clock, if she glanced at it at all, was not what told her when to stop. The first few minutes, the dough resisted. It was sticky, unruly, inclined to cling to the surface and to her hands. The kind of sticky that makes a beginner add too much flour too quickly. She dusted as needed, just a little, a scatter from the palm, and worked on, and the dough absorbed it and still clung. And then gradually began to change. The surface that had been torn and rough began to smooth. The mass that had been loose and uncertain began to pull itself together, to develop something like intention, like coherence. The gluten in the flour was forming its long, elastic strands, and you could feel it happening if you were the one kneading. The dough becoming springier, more responsive, beginning to push back against the hands with a gentle, living resist. And if you stood close enough, if you were a child standing beside her, as children often did, drawn by the warmth and the smell and the simple pleasure of watching someone do something well, you could hear it. The soft, rhythmic thud of the dough being turned and pressed. The faint squeak of the board against the counter. The steady, unhurried breath of the woman working, entirely at ease in this task, her hands moving with the kind of confidence that only comes from having done a thing hundreds of times. There was also this. The first slice off a fresh loaf was never meant for the person who baked it. It was always for someone else. We will come back to that. But right now the dough is still finding itself, still becoming, and the best of what this morning holds is still ahead. When the dough was ready, and she knew when it was ready, not by any clock or thermometer, but by the feel of it under her palms. A knowledge transferred from her own mother's kitchen into her hands without ever being written down. It had been smooth, satiny at the surface, slightly tacky, but no longer sticky, elastic in the way that is almost pleasurable to touch, the way it pushed back gently when you pressed it with a thumb, and then slowly, patiently, filled the hollow back in it. Yes, she would press it with one finger and watch the indent rise. And that rising, that slow, living, confident return, told her everything she needed to know. Do you remember watching her check it? That quiet, practiced little gesture, one thumb pressed in, a moment's pause, a small nod to herself that meant the dough had passed the only test that mattered. She formed it into a smooth ball, rounded with a few careful turns between her palms, and set it back in the bowl. The bowl had been lightly greased, a wipe of butter or lard across the inside, and the dough was turned once so all sides were coated, so it would not dry or crack during the rise. And then the tea towel, a clean one, washed enough times to be thin and soft, white or with a faint stripe of blue or red, draped over the top of the bowl with a domestic precision that was entirely unremarkable and entirely right. The bowl was carried to its warm place, near the back of the stove, where the residual heat from the morning's cooking still gathered, beside the radiator in the hallway, or in winter, sometimes set inside the oven with only the pilot light going. That faint, constant, bone-dry heat that the yeast needed the way a sleeping thing needs a warm room. And then, the waiting. This was the part that children found hardest. It required a kind of patience that runs against the grain of childhood, the patience of someone who understands that certain things simply cannot be hurried, that the chemistry of yeast and flour and time has its own schedule, and your an hour, usually. Sometimes a little more if the kitchen was on the cool side, or if the yeast had been a little slow to bloom. And during that hour, the bowl sat in its corner with the tea towel over it, motionless from the outside, alive underneath, the dough breathing its slow breath, the yeast consuming its small ration of sugar and exhaling the carbon dioxide TXA. The kitchen was not still during this time. Life moved around the bowl, Lunch was perhaps made at the other end of the counter. A pot of something was on the stove. The radio played in the background. The news, or a morning program, or something with music that no one was quite listening to, but that everyone appreciated. A child did homework at the table. Another played on the floor with something quiet. And above all of it, already beginning to build, the faint, warm, living scent of yeast doing its patient work in the corner. Have you ever noticed how a kitchen with rising bread in it feels different from a kitchen without? Warmer somehow, even when the temperature hasn't changed. More complete, as though the room knows it has something important in progress. When she lifted the tea towel, and she knew when to lift it, she did not check constantly, but went when something told her it was time, a form of knowledge that lived below the level of conscious thought. The dough had doubled. It was a soft, slightly quivering dome pressing up against the underside of the towel, the surface smooth and faintly damp with the breath of its own rising. The smell that came from it fuller now than it had been before. Yeastier, dory, no, deeper, with an alcohol note underneath, the dough having begun its own small fermentation, the aroma of something alive and ready. Her fist went into it, not violently, with purpose. Down into the center, a clean push, and the beautiful, satisfying sound of the gas releasing. The dough collapsing around her hand with a soft whoosh that was, to anyone who has heard it, one of the more quietly satisfying sounds in all of the more quietly satisfying sounds in all of. She turned the dough out onto the floured surface again, kneaded it briefly, a minute or two, just enough to redistribute the yeast and even out the gas, and then divided it. 2 pieces, perhaps, if she was making 2 loaves, each one shaped with those sure, practiced hands into a smooth oblong, the surface pulled taut and tucked underneath, the seam pressed against the bottom, into the bread pans. The pans deserve a word, because they were not incidental. They were almost certainly aluminum, the kind that had darkened over years to a deep, burnished gray-brown, seasoned by hundreds of bakings, never washed with soap because soap would strip what the years had built, only rinsed in hot water, dried immediately, sometimes wiped with fat. They were working pans, not beautiful ones. Pans that had earned their place through reliable service. Exactly wide and deep enough that the shaped loaves would dumb beautifully above the rim in that characteristic, slightly cracked curve. The loaves went in. The tea towel came back. The second rise, shorter, half an hour perhaps, just until the rounded tops of the loaves were trembling above the rim of the pans, light and taut and ready. The oven was on, not the modern precision of a digital display, and an audible preheat signal, the gas oven with its turned dial, the faint blue pop of the flame catching, the heat estimated by a woman who knew what hot enough felt like when she held her hand near the rack for a count of 3. 350 degrees, or 375. Hot enough to set the crust golden in the time it needed. Not so hot that the outside would burn before the interior was done. She knew this without needing to be told. The oven had been hers long enough that they understood each other. And here, precisely here, is where the smell begins in earnest. The oven door opened with that characteristic creak. The spring-loaded hinge, slightly tight, requiring a pull that was always just a little more deliberate than you expected, and the draft of hot air rushed out into the kitchen, carrying. The pans slid in on the rack. The door closed. And within minutes, 3 minutes, 4, the kitchen changed. The faint, living yeastiness of the proofing dough gave way to something richer, fuller, more complex. The proteins in the flour began to brown against the heat. The natural sugars in the dough began their caramelization. That slow, fragrant transformation of simple sweetness into something golden and nutty and almost impossibly good. The steam rising from the loaves, trapped momentarily inside the oven, worked against the crust to keep it supple just long enough before the heat dried and set it into something firm and golden and crackling. And the smell of all of this, the browning, the caramelizing, the steam, the baking, found its way through the seal of the oven door and out into the kitchen, and from the kitchen into the hall, and from the hall under the front door, and out, and then it traveled. It is almost impossible to describe accurately, which is itself part of what makes it powerful. You know it if you know it. It is not quite like anything else, though it borrows notes from several things. The warmth of something toasted, but without the sharpness. The sweetness of caramelized sugar, but much gentler, much more enveloping. The earthiness of gray. It has emotional content, this smell. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a neurological fact. The olfactory system has the most direct route of any sense to the limbic system, the part of the brain where emotion and memory live, and the smell of baking bread goes there immediately and without permission, bypassing the reasoning mind. For most people who grew up with it, the association is this: safety, warmth, presence. The knowledge that someone nearby was doing something slow and generous and entirely for others. You probably haven't smelled that exact smell in 30 years. But right now you can, can't you? The loaves baked for 35 minutes, sometimes 40, the kitchen filling as they baked, the whole house filling, the smell traveling room to room and floor to floor, climbing the stairs, finding its way under bedroom doors, if the windows were open. On a mild Saturday in October, say, or a warm June morning, the smell found its way out and down the street and around the corner and into the nose of a child on their way home from somewhere. Just at the moment, it said, "Someone is there." It said, "Come," and you ran. Gee, you ran the last bit, because something in you understood, without having been taught it, that the window between too hot to cut and merely warm was brief and belonged to whoever arrived in time to claim. Meanwhile, she was checking. The oven door opened partway, the smell gusting out in a concentrated wave, and the color was what she looked for. That deep, even unmistakable gold that meant the crust was properly set. Not pale yellow, not merely tan, the specific, unambiguous color of bread that had been in the right oven at the right temperature for the right amount of time. She would take one pan out with the oven mitt, the thick, faded, slightly scorched oven mitt that hung on its hook beside the stove and had absorbed years of heat and kitchen life, and she would turn the loaf out into her other hand, and she would turn the loaf out into her other hand. And then she tapped the bottom with one knuckle, a single sharp tap against the base of the loaf. If it sounded hollow, a dry, resonant sound like a knuckle on an empty wooden box, the bread was done. If it sounded dense and dull, back it went for another 5 minutes, and the test repeated. This assessment, passed down through generations of bread bakers, required nothing more than an ear trained by experience. And she had that ear. The loaves that had not quite finished would go back in. The loaves that were done would go onto the rack, and she would do the same with the second pan. And within a minute, both loaves were out, turned upright on the wire cooling rack. The kitchen at its absolute fullest and most fragrant. What was the first thing you did when the loaf came out of the oven? Did you pull off the crust or wait for a buttered slice? The wire rack. A simple thing. Pressed steel wires in a grid, legs an inch high, had its own role in the ritual, one that was easy to overlook. It held the hot loaves up off the counter so the air could circulate under them, so the bottom crust would not steam and go soft, so the full golden crispness of the crust could complete itself as the bread cooled. And the bread cooled, crackling softly as it did, a quiet, rhythmic series of small sounds as the crust contracted over the cooling interior, the two materials finding their equilibrium, the loaf settling into its final self. If you pressed your ear close to a fresh loaf cooling on its rack, you could hear it breathing. That faint tick-tick-tick of the crust, barely audible, entirely alive. She would say, "Just wait a moment. It's too hot to cut yet." And the children, whoever was in the kitchen, whoever had arrived at the run, would hover, standing as near to the cooling rack as patience and the heat allowed, watching the loaves with an attention rarely given to anything stationary. The smell at this moment was at its fullest, its most generous, its most completely itself. The Maillard reaction. All those browned proteins, all those caramelized sugars, had done their work inside the oven, and now the heat still radiating from the loaves released them in slow, continuous waves into the air of the kitchen. If you had simply stood in that kitchen and breathed, without yet tasting a thing, you would have felt something and you fed. Not hunger satisfied, exactly. Something subtler and more fundamental than that. The feeling of being in the right place at the right time, in a warm room that smells of care. And now is the moment to keep the first promise. There was one thing every bread baker did before putting the loaf in the oven. A small, almost superstitious gesture that no recipe ever mentioned. And it was this. She would pause, just for a moment, with the shaped loaf settled in its greased pan, risen and trembling and ready, and she would look at it. Not check it or examine it with the eyes of a technician assessing a process. Simply look at it, the way you look at something you have made with considerable effort, and feel some quiet satisfaction in, as though the loaf deserved, before the heat of the oven took it and transformed it further, a moment of acknowledgement. Some women did this with their hands pressed gently flat against the shaped dough, feeling the warmth of it, the living give of it, the gentle resistance of the gas-filled interior. Some did it by drawing a shallow score along the top with the tip of a knife, a single cut along the crown of the loaf, not strictly necessary for the baking, but a gesture of care, of intention, of marking the thing as made by these hands. It was never in any cookbook. It was not listed as a step in any recipe published in any decade. But it happened in kitchen after kitchen, generation after generation, because bread is one of the oldest things humans have ever made for one another. And the women who made understood, in some wordless, bone-deep way, that it asked for not ceremony, not ritual for its own sake, just a moment's acknowledgement that something living was about to become something nourishing, and that deserved to be noticed. And now, the second promise. The first slice off a fresh loaf was never meant for the person who baked it. It was always for someone else. The heel, the end piece, the outer crust, baked deepest and most golden, the piece that every child who had ever stood in that kitchen had privately hoped would be theirs, came off with the first cut of the serrated knife. The knife moved through it with that particular sound, the slight resistance of the crust giving way, the soft interior yielding cleanly, the steam rising in a small, faint cloud from the cut surface. She would hold the heel for a moment on the flat of the knife blade, and then the butter would go on, pressed on while the bread was still hot enough that it melted instantly, disappeared into the open crumb, left only the faintest shine, and sometimes, often, there was a sprinkle of cinnamon and sugar on top of the butter. On the heel, just a small, fragrant dusting, the cinnamon dark against the pale butter, the sugar glinting, pressed on with the back of a knife and handed, with a warmth that required no explanation, to the child standing nearest. The child who had waited with the most visible need, or the most endearing impatience, or simply the one who had been there longest and earned it by proximity and patience. She never took the first slice. The women who baked bread in house after house and decade after decade did not take the first slice for themselves. They watched someone else eat it. A child, a husband, the neighbor who had appeared at the back door just as the bread came off the rack, as if the smell itself had sent a personal invitation, and the watching was its own form of nourishment. The satisfaction in that watching was real and particular. The pleasure of a maker seeing the thing made, received, and consumed, and enjoyed. It fed something in her that the bread itself could not have fed. Her hands never needed a recipe. They remembered. The rest of the loaf would give a dozen slices, thick ones, generous ones, nothing like the uniform, tissue-thin slices of commercial bread. Homemade bread did not submit to perfect uniformity. Each slice was slightly different from the one before. The crumb more open in the center, denser toward the ends, the crust thicker on the long sides, thinner on top, the air pockets irregular in the way of something made by hand and risen, and none of this variation was a fault. It was evidence of the hands, the yeast, the oven, the day. A homemade loaf was specific to a time and place and person in a way that no manufactured food can be. For dinner that evening, the bread appeared on the table in a cloth-lined basket, still faintly warm, and disappeared with a speed that was in itself a kind of eloquent praise, the family eating without needing to say what was obvious. This it. For school lunches the next day, she was up before anyone else, the breadboard out, the knife moving rhythmically, while the children were still upstairs finding their shoes. The quiet, early morning ritual of slicing bread for people who WW. The homemade bread made the best toast. Under the grill, the cut surfaces browned and crisped, while the interior stayed soft. The smell in the morning kitchen, a gentle, warm echo of the baking day before. Quieter, less full, but recognizable. A kind of residue of the event. The thaw. By the third day, the bread was denser, cheerier, the crumb more settled, the crust a little tougher, and still better than most things, more flavorful than its commercial counterpart, with the depth that comes from real fermentation and feed. By the end of the week, the last heel would go out to the birds in the yard, or be kept back for breadcrumbs, grated into a bowl, saved in a jar on the shelf for a future gratin or a meatloaf. The bread continuing to be useful even past. The bread continuing to be useful even past. Nothing was wasted. It had been too fully made for waste. And then, the following Monday or Saturday, the bowl would be brought out again. Now, a word about the variations. Because not every house smelled the same when bread was baking, even in the same street, even in the same decade. In some kitchens, the bread was whole wheat, darker, more serious, the dough a deeper brown even before baking, the smell carrying an extra earthiness, A slight bitterness of bran softened by a spoonful of molasses worked into the mix. The whole wheat was for the health-conscious household, or for the mother who had grown up in a place where heartiness was simply how bread tasted. In Jewish households on Fridays, the bread was challah, braided with care, the 3 or 4 strands woven over and under with practiced hands, the finished braid set to proof on a greased sheet, the smell as it baked sweeter and more tend. Challah was pulled apart at the table, not sliced. Its texture was cloud-like and slightly sweet, perfect for the evening meal set with intention. The smell of it baking was both the smell of bread and the smell of a specific day and a specific love. In German families, in households with Eastern European roots, rye bread was the bread, dense and fragrant, with caraway, the crust thick and hard, the crumb tight, the color deep. The smell of rye baking was different from any other bread, earthier and more pungent, with a sharp, slightly medicinal note of caraway woven through it. If you grew up with that smell as the smell of baking day, then that was home. That was the loaf cooling on the rack, the knife in the drawer, the butter on the table. Not white bread and not whole wheat, but rye, specifically, irreplaceably. In Irish homes there was soda bread, no yeast at all, no rising, no waiting. Just buttermilk and baking soda reacting quickly in the bowl. The dough mixed and shaped, and into the oven in under 10 minutes. The smell not of fermentation, but soda bread asked for less time, but not less skill. The hands that knew it completely. In the American South, cornbread baked in a cast iron skillet slid into a hot oven, the smell of cornmeal toasting, the bread yellow and slightly sweet and crisp-edged from the fat in the pan, the kitchen smelling not of yeast, but of some samine, not of yeast, but of some. And in homes where women had come from another place, from Italy or Poland or Greece or the Caribbean, or any of the dozens of countries whose daughters found themselves in North American and British kitchens in the 1960s. The bread on the 60s, the bread on the smell of it baking would carry, alongside the universal warmth of bread, something particular to the place it had come from, something that no one else in the street was making. Every variation had its own smell, every smell had its own address. But all of them had one thing in common. All of them meant that someone had stood in a kitchen and made bread. Made it with time that could have been spent doing other things. Made it because the family needed bread, and because making it yourself was what you did. Not because it was fashionable, not because it was therapeutic in any language they would have used, but because the store-bought loaf, however convenient, Wonder bread was already on the supermarket shelf in those years. Soft and uniform and shelf-stable. And it was not bad bread. But homemade bread was not even in the same category as bread. It was in the category of care. It was in the category of time given. Did you stand beside her while she kneaded, drawn by the warmth, hoping she'd let you help? Some children were allowed to help. A small piece of dough set aside, torn off, perhaps a fist-sized piece, dusted with a little flour and pressed into the child's hands, and the child kneading with tremendous seriousness, pressing with all available weight, folding improperly. A small roll placed in the pan alongside the proper loaves, or baked on the sheet beside them. The child's initials sometimes pressed in with a fingertip. Baked golden alongside everything else. Set on the rack. Eaten first and declared magnificent with complete honesty. Because it was theirs. There is everything important in that image. The child's small hands beside the larger, practiced ones. The flour on both sets. The same dough, the same motion. Two levels of skill, one learning from the other without formal instruction. The hands teaching the hands. The knowledge passing through touch rather than words, the way the most enduring things have always passed. Some of those children grew up and had their own kitchens and their own bread-baking days. They reached for the knowledge not in any written recipe, but in the feel in their palms. The way the dough told you when it was ready, the sound the bottom of the loaf made when tapped. And in their kitchens, the same smell rose, traveled down the street, brought their own children home at a run. The knowledge passed in flour, the love passed in warmth. It wasn't just food, it was the smell of home itself. There was also this, the loaf that was given away. In those neighborhoods where people still knew their neighbors. And in the 1960s, in most places, they did. The post-war residential streets of North America and Britain and Australia were places where doors were known and names were used. The natural response when someone had been ill or had a new baby or was getting on in years and didn't bake anymore and lived alone at the end of the terrace. A loaf, still faintly warm, wrapped in a clean tea towel and tied loosely at the top with the ends turned over, carried by a child sent on the errand, with instructions to walk carefully and hold it with both hands and not set it down anyway. The woman at the door would take it with both hands. She would press it gently, feel the warmth still in it. She would lift it and breathe it in. And something in her face would do something that a child watching could not quite name but would remember. A softening, a private gratitude that went past politeness into something truer, because she knew what it had cost. Not money, time. The morning. Dot, noi, by. The measuring, the mixing, the kneading, the waiting, the baking. All of that done with her in mind. That is what bread meant. That is what it had always meant. My hands were busy this morning, and my mind was on you. Can you still see the flour on her apron, the light dusting on the counter, the way she pushed her hair back from her forehead, with her wrist, because her hands were not free? There was no glamour to it. The apron was cotton and practical, and stained at the front from years of kitchen work. The counter was floury, and would need to be wiped. The work was physical, the kneading hard enough on the hands and arms and shoulders that women who baked every week developed a real, visible strength in those muscles, the kind of strength that lived in the forearms, and was evident in the forearms, and was evident in the fore. There was the washing up afterward, the bowl, the spoon, the board, the pans. More work after the work, as there always is in a kitchen. And then the following Monday, or Saturday, it would begin again. No one made a film about it. No one photographed it for a magazine. The women who baked bread every week for their families did it without audience, without recognition beyond the family table, without anything other than the knowledge, solid and sufficient, that the family would eat well in the house. This was the gift of time freely given. Hours, real, irreplaceable hours, pulled from days that were already full, given to flour and water and a small living packet of yeast, and the people who would eat the result, given without fanfare, without expectation of particular gratitude, in the way that genuine and habitual love is always given, not when it is convenient, but consistently, on a specific day of the week, as a practice rather than an occasion. When did you last smell bread, baking from scratch, in a home kitchen? And why don't we fill our houses with that smell anymore? That question sits quietly for a moment, doesn't it? We have the yeast, still in the same small packets. We have the flour. We have the time, or something that could become time, if we chose differently. The art has not been lost. Bread is being baked right now, in homes all over the world, with real yeast and real flour and real patient hands. And the kitchens those bakers work and smell exactly the same as the kitchens we are remembering. The chemistry has not changed. The process has not changed. Yeast still wants warmth. Flour still wants water. Dough still rises in its own time and bakes golden and fills the house with that smell. But for many of us, it became something chosen rather than something simply done, a deliberate act rather than a weekly given. And in the years between, the long years of convenience and speed, of the sliced and bagged loaf from the supermarket, something went missing from the air. Not from the food, necessarily. From the air, the smell of a home kitchen where bread is baking is, for most people who experienced it in childhood, the single most powerful scent memory they carry, more immediate than perfume, more transporting than any other food. Neuroscientists note that olfactory memory bypasses the reasoning mind almost entirely, going straight to the emotional centers, the amygdala, the hippocampus, depositing the person directly inside the memory, rather than presenting it at a time. Which is why it is not quite right to say that the smell of baking bread reminds you of your childhood. It is more accurate to say it returns you to it. Briefly, entirely, without preparation. You are there. The kitchen is there. She is there. Her hands that knew. Close your eyes for a moment. Just for a moment, and let what you remember build itself from the pieces. The bowl on the counter, heavy, cool to the touch at first, warming as the dough went in. The tea towel draped over it, the small, intimate tint of fabric over the rising dough. The kitchen warm and slightly humid, the windows faintly steamed at the corners. The smell just beginning, of yeast waking in warm water. That earthy, slightly sweet, ancient smell. Then the thud and turn and push of kneading. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, the rhythmic sound of it. The ball of smooth, elastic dough going back into the bowl. The quiet of the rise. The punch down. The whoosh of air. The shaped loaves in their dark pans. The second wait. The oven. And then the smell. That smell, rising first as warmth, then as sweetness, then as the full, golden, nutty, yeasty, irreducible fragrance of baking bread, finding every corner of the house, going out through the walls into the street, traveling to the end of the road and of the street. The loaves come out of the oven, golden, slightly domed, cracked along the top where the heat pushed the dough upward and the crust parted to let it through. She sets them on the wire rack. The steam curls softly upward from the tops. The kitchen is at its most alive, its most fully itself, warm, fragrant, unhurried, complete. The neighbor appears at the back door. The children gather near the counter. Just wait a moment. It's too hot to cut yet. But the moment passes. The moment always passes, with patience and the willingness to wait for the thing that is worth waiting for. The serrated knife comes down. The crust gives with that small, dry sound. The steam rises from the cut face of the loaf. The first slice, the heel, the special piece, is pressed with butter, the butter melting instantly in the warmth, soaking into the soft crumb, pooling in the open pockets of the interior. perhaps a sprinkle of cinnamon sugar. The child holds it in both hands, warm, slightly too hot, and bites into it. Crust cracking, interior yielding, butter and salt and sweetness and yeast, all together in a flavor that is, and has always been, the taste of having arrived somewhere and found everything ready and warm. The bowl will be washed and set back on the shelf. The flour-dusted counter wiped clean with a damp cloth. The flour turning briefly to a paste before being gathered up and gone. The apron hung on its hook. The oven switched off. The kitchen will cool through the afternoon, though the smell will not leave it quickly. It will stay in the curtains, in the wooden surface of the table, in the very air of the room, a warm residue of the morning, a lingering presence. Hours later, passing through the kitchen to get a glass of water, you could still smell it. Faintly, softer, without the power of the fresh loaf, but unmistakably there. The room still knew what it had been that day. A place where someone had stood and made something with their hands. Something that took flour and water and a little living yeast and hours of patience and transformed them, through heat and chemistry and care, into the thing that fed the family and filled the house with warmth and traveled down the street. Someone is taking care. Someone loves the people in that house. You could smell it from the end of the street, and it meant one thing. Someone at home loved you. You ran the last half block. You pushed open the back door, and the warmth of the kitchen hit you. The dense, golden, yeasty heat of a room where bread had been baking all morning, and she was there. Her hands dusted with flour, her apron on, a smear of white on her wrist where she had brushed her hair back from her face. She looked up when you came in. Just looked up. A brief glance. Ordinary. And everything. And she said, because she always said it, just wait a moment. It's too hot to cut yet. And you waited. And the bread was warm. Warm. And you were home.